Well, good afternoon and welcome to another of our live family talks. It's great to see you here. We're usually quite a small, select bunch that come to these talks, but we do record them, so a lot more people are able to access them online, which is fantastic. Be good if we could do this almost like a conversation, since we're quite a small group, and Karyn will answer any questions at all, she says, but obviously within the topic that we're talking about. So please have your questions ready and we'll have a chat, but I'll also have some questions for Karyn. So I'm Linda de Caestecker. Some of us, many of us have met before at these events. I'm a public health doctor. And I'll just, before Karyn starts, ask her, tell us who you are and tell us a bit about yourself.
So I'm Karyn McCluskey. I am at the moment, I'm the Chief Exec of Community Justice Scotland. I was previously headed up the Violence Reduction Unit in Glasgow and did all the violence reduction work. I actually originally trained as a nurse, and I trained here. I'm actually a Falkirk bairn, so it's quite nice to be back. I trained as a nurse and then trained as a forensic psychologist, and then I was in the police. I worked in the prisons, was in the police for 22 years. So I've had a bit of a variety of backgrounds, and I also sit on the board of professional football. So it's quite nice to be looking at that and being here.
Well, I remember when we first met, I just started as Director of Public Health in Glasgow. You were in the Violence Reduction Unit, and we talked about parenting.
We did.
Even though for both of us, it was a particular interest and we wanted to see it develop, but it wasn't a main part of either. Well, it is a main part of our jobs, but it was really great to talk about that. So I'm going to pass over to you, Karyn. You're going to talk for about 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll move into questions.
So I was actually going to do something visual. And then I thought, I actually can't do something, I can't talk and point at things when it's meant to be a podcast. So I just thought I'd just canter through a few things. So I'll tell you what I think about sort of youth violence just now, what's happening, some of the things, some of the problem identification. I mean, I go to a lot of meetings, and it's full of the problem admirers, the ones that say, oh, let's go on about just how bad it is and all the problems we could get to. And then I keep saying, right, tell me what your solutions are. And then there's dead silence in the room. But people I think it's partly being Scottish, isn't it? That Calvinism, I want to tell you how bad it is. So I sort of wanted to talk about other bits. But see, at the beginning, I work in a lot of schools. And I get to go in and I really love it, mainly because I'm not young anymore. But I would hate to be young right now. And I know I'm trying to look in the audience who's out here and, who's still at school and of that school age. And even amongst the young people, you're probably not in that culture because the generation is so different. And I'm not sure I could cope with the pressures of things like social media, the interrupted schooling that they've had, AI. World Economic Forum was out just a couple of weeks ago saying that 40% of the jobs that we have right now will not exist by 2030. So things are changing so quickly for people. They've got this rapidly changing world, 24/7 media. And I'm just, I just think it must be overwhelming. And yet when I go into schools, I'm blown away by how smart they are. How, they're challenging, they ask you questions. And and they're taller than me, which always gets me, because I'm 5'4" and I look at all these kids who are like so much taller than me and I think they are definitely genetically, we've obviously fed them better. And most of them are taking less alcohol and drugs. Sometimes I'll talk to them and they'll talk about, I don't drink. The amount of young people now that I hear about and they say, well, I don't drink. Now, that's mostly drugs is still involved. And I also think they're more worldly and they're more challenging and they're less likely to accept a status quo. So I hope that when I go into this, you hold on to that the vast majority are leading good lives and they'll be taking care of us in old folks' homes and in care, in the future. So I don't like to demonise them. And the average age of people in prison just now is not young, it's 35-year-olds. It's 35-year-olds. And the violence that we see is predominantly older people. So I'm going to start off by doing the very thing that I said I would, which is a bit of problem admiration. So when I started first doing the work in violence, And predominantly it was youth violence. I found a bit of CCTV about a murder, and I was going to use some of it today because it's as relevant now, and I looked at it again last night as it was when I put it together in 2003. So I found a piece of footage, and it was of a murder. And Linda, you'll have seen this. And I don't know whether lots of you have seen me doing this thing called David's Story. So I find this piece of CCTV that's about this murder. And what I decided, because at that time I was working in intelligence, so I put together the whole life story. And if I asked you, without you telling me, tell me about that young person's life, I bet you would get it 90% correct. So before he's born, he's got a mum that's addicted to alcohol. She lives on income support, lives in a really challenged area. Domestic violence in the house. He's moved house at the age of 3 because of, a violent partner. Then goes on to another house where she gets another violent partner and then has to move again. Goes to school, gets taken away from his mum because his mum can't cope at the age of 8 and goes to live with a granny. But in that house there are 3 or 4 adult males with 160 convictions between them. And that's where we put an 8-year-old boy because his mum couldn't cope. And then all the problems about alcohol and drugs and constant chaos and trying to do that physical regeneration, so he moves house all the time. And by the time he gets to 11 and 12, he starts to get involved in crime. He gets involved in youth violence, and he's involved in stealing cars and all the things that you would know. And I remember showing the piece of footage to Harry Burns at the time. And I said to Harry, what do you think of this? And he said, I probably think he had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder that was undiagnosed. Now, I haven't met him or able to diagnose him, but as that potential is true. And when I spoke to the head teacher, he said to me, well, he was the most diminutive boy in the year. And that was when Harry was talking about, some of the other factors. He commits a murder at the age of 15 and a half. And when I showed it to people, I had a primary school teacher who said to me, I told you he was going to be I could have told you he was going to be a Daily Record headline when he was 5. I said, all right, what did you do about it? And it was like, well, I didn't do anything. It was just, I knew that. I could pick up all the indications. And, it's one of these things, when I look at the list of violence indicators, that sort of violence in the broader family, or the deprivation, or the peers that come from the same backgrounds, exclusion from school, which I'm going to talk about later on, communities where violence was normalised, and whole roads, when I looked at whole roads where houses were full of people who were often in the same pattern of offending and background, and criminality is rife, joblessness, who's got a job, who's got purpose in their life, and just a generalised lack of hope. And that's a real recipe for disaster and ill health and all the things that you would have known in public health. And then to add on that, the list for youth violence, things that you could do, things like poverty, lack of youth services, bullying, poor mental health, exposure to violent content online. I never look at anything like that. I'm very much, I like rom-coms. I'll never see anything that's violent. Peer pressure, poor parental supervision. And I'm talking about parental supervision, not parents. Because actually it's about how we supervise young people, how we give them the good role models and everything else that they need. And in short, you would all recognise that that's a problem admiration. And I remember going out and speaking with my colleague John to lots and lots of people. And I showed them this life story. And people would come up and say, absolutely, that's terrible. I had people crying in the back of the audience. I would say, that's terrible. And in my naive bit, I thought they would go and do something. And what happened was nothing. People said, oh, you're really good at this. You're good. You're a good speaker. And they didn't do anything. And actually, it was a conversation I had with public health colleagues who said, you need to tell them what to do. You need to tell them what works, what changes things. If you cut me in half, I would have prevention right the way through me. I just think, and when I worked in policing, we were great at detecting crime. We had like a 98% detection rate per murder. It didn't solve it, didn't prevent it. And I know I've got policing colleagues in the audience today. The most important Peelian principle, when Peel set up the police, he said prevention of crime is a good litmus test of policing. So that's not about the starry bit, that standing up saying we detected this. It's about preventing it. And that's really challenging. It's unseen. But absence of evidence is no evidence of absence. And we need to get cleverer at how we try and prevent things. So we started to tell people how to prevent it. And like, this could be a long lecture, so I'm not going to do it. And I could talk to you about all the things that we did at that point when, working in hospitals and such like, and I'm not going to. I'm going to talk about the broader prevention. We could talk about the policing and all this sort of starry stuff that we did. But the bigger and more complicated bit is, I suppose, the thing that we should get into today, because at the heart of it, and I've been talking to some of the people before we came in, is safe and supportive relationships. I mean, that is as close as it gets to being magic without being magic. And I think we forget about that in this online life. We talk about that being part of social connection. But human beings are born connected. We need each other. We need each other to try and have safe and understand the lives that we have. And I think that Scotland's flourished. I mean, you've done loads of early years in public health. I love public health. I do. I love practical public health, how it can change whole communities and countries if you really embrace lots of the things that they purport around early intervention, around giving parents the support. And we've done that, but perhaps we haven't done it enough to give parents support. I've got a young friend who's just had a baby, and her life has been, she's been in care. She's got nobody around her, and she was sending me pictures of the baby the other day. And now she's got lots of she's got lots of supportive relationships around her, and I think she'll be a great mum. But I do worry about the ones that don't have that relationship, that can't phone you up and ask you about, medical stuff or nursing stuff or what should I do, because that's really difficult. And when I'm talking to people about the evidence base, I often talk about Finland. Now, when I went to Finland, I'm a vegetarian, and they tried to feed me reindeer and said that was vegetarian. I was like, I don't think it is. But Finland's the same size as Scotland. There's only 5 million Finns. So I quite like the fact that there's only 5 million of us. If you look at the evidence base about countries that have changed and have better outcomes for people, the magic number is 5 million. So I can shut my eyes and think about Scotland. I can think about Aberdeen and Inverness and the Shetlands, and you can hold it in your head and you can think, we could change this. I mean, perfectly possible to change this. But in Finland, they have this nation of pedagogues. So 5% of the working population are pedagogues. So they're a mixture of sort of social work and health and nursing, and 50% of them are men, paid really well. They support every child in the family until the age of 8. Every child. They do risk-taking, they put their babies outside in the cold. It's really interesting about how they absolutely think that that first part of their lives are so important. And then when they go to school, the Finns they don't have educational outcomes like we do, about reading and writing. Their only educational outcomes are, and it's going to sound a bit Soviet when I say this, is to turn out the best equipped kids to meet the needs of the nation. So they focus on communication, problem solving, team working, compassion, empathy. These are all the skills that make you a good human being, that allow you to get through life without bumping into, alcohol and drugs and making the right decision. And I sort of really love that. The upside of that, interestingly, is see when they actually test their kids at the age of 14, they turn out the best educated kids in the world. Who knew? They're always at the top of the OECD PISA study for reading and writing because they give this kids skills to be able to engage. And there is something about, you can't just say we want to be like Scandinavia without actually investing in it and changing the culture. And I think when I'm out speaking to people, and I hope that when I'm speaking to you, I rather like the strapline that we would like Scotland to be the best place in the world to grow up. We want the best outcomes for our kids. I would subscribe to that. I would vote for that. That's what I would vote for. But to do that, we actually need to have a verb in our sentence. And I'm a nurse. I quite like a verb in my sentence. You know that? A doing word. I love a doing word. And then keeping kids in school. Of every young person that I've met that's been involved in youth violence, and I used to go into Parliament prison all the time. And if I forget to mention it, when I started, and this is not down to me, but to everybody, we had almost 1,000 under-18s in Parliament prison. Now we have 0. Now, that's not to say that the problem is fixed, but we shouldn't be incarcerating our kids. It is not the right place for them to be. And I know that lots of the care services and perhaps even care visions are trying to address some of these young people who are very dysregulated, who can't manage their own behaviours and emotions, but it's still the right thing to do. And if I stop doing this tomorrow, I still think I'd say that's the right thing. Now, I know that some of these young people who commit some terrible offences might go into the adult prison population later on, but that's all right as long as we're managing their behaviour and trying to give them that safe, supportive relationships right now when they're young people, because we know that their brains don't mature. People hate me when I'm talking about this, about the fact that we've got this whole research around neuropsychology knowing that young people's brains don't mature until they're 25. And we sentence differently because of that. And people don't like it. And I'm saying, you might not like it, but the evidence is the evidence is the evidence. So it's true. But the thing that I do in schools around zero is I try and practice zero exclusion. Because one more kid you keep in school is one less kid I'll have in jail. Now, my dad was a head teacher, and he used to say to me, that's a really hard ask. And I know it's a hard ask. And I have been in lots of, I go into schools and I ask teachers to try and think about how they adapt to some of the kids' behaviours, how they try and, keep these kids who would actually be much easier out of school because often they don't contribute to the attainment, targets that we have in schools. And yet, actually, can I tell you, it's probably one of the most important things that we do. And Glasgow was absolutely at the forefront of it. It said to all its head teachers, we really need to keep kids in school. They brought in the nurture rooms. They really strive to keep children in. And I think, long term, I think that's what will make a difference. Because I don't know who people think that they'll bump into if they're not in school. Well, it's the police. What's it they say about idle hands do the devil's work? They're found on the top of roofs, on abandoned buildings, bumping into people that we don't want them to meet. And just recently I had a conversation about organised crime and some of the young people getting used, in terms of selling drugs, in terms of cutting drugs. Who knew that would happen? So things like zero exclusion. And then conflict resolution. So we don't do much conflict resolution. So I do a lot in conflict, mainly because I work in football as well, around how do you disagree well? We don't really disagree well in Scotland, do we? We march off in the huff. But you need to be able to teach people how to disagree well. So if you have conflict, how do you teach people to step back? How do you give them the words to be able to step back from an argument? Of the violence that I have seen that has happened, often leading to really terrible events like murders, it has started online with conflict. And then it just escalates and escalates and escalates. And the young people that I meet, and in fact lots of the adults, do not have the skills to be able to de-escalate. I used to say when I started the violence reduction unit, it takes more of a man to walk away from a fight than it does to man up. I hate using that word, but that was the sort of vernacular, and then engage in a fight, which often ended tragically. But we need to absolutely talk about conflict resolution, and not just for young people. Glasgow, and I'm using Glasgow just because I'm really close to it, but other areas are looking at this just now, teach their kids conflict resolution in the schools. And they do restorative justice, which I quite like. So the kids, if there's arguments in the playground and that are spilling out, do restorative justice with them so they get each other to speak to each other. And then they come to an agreement about what they think the punishment should be or the resolution. And it's fantastic. One of my favourite primary schools, which is Dalmarnock Primary School, are fantastic at this. But you know what the problem is? The parents. Because the kids go home and say, this is what happened and this is how we resolved it. And the parents march into school and say, I want him excluded. So we actually need to put it out in the communities as well. Who knew that would be a problem? And then just some of the bystander work. We've been doing bystander work, trying to do peer work, so that if you hear your friend saying something, you've got the words to intervene, whether that's around how we talk about women. I'm going to talk about incel culture and the manosphere slightly later on. So we've been doing that, teaching coping skills and strategies about how you manage your emotions. I think we all need that. I count to 10 a lot. I do a lot of running, just why my knees completely is rubbish now. But we all have things. Everybody has something that they do to manage their stress and their emotions, and we need to give that to kids as well. And then mentoring. Everybody needs somebody. Everybody needs somebody. A good mentor. You know that, whether it's a janitor, but it's a football coach. Somebody that young people can go to that's not their parents. So I parented a teenager, and I'm sure everybody else in here knows what teenagers like. I used to say it was a bit like the Apollo 13 mission. You know that? It goes out of contact as it was going round the dark side of the moon. For those that don't know the Apollo 13 mission, there was loads of things. They lost communication. There was loads of problems. And they had to bounce it round the dark side of the moon to get it back on a trajectory. And I always think that's what parenting teenagers is like. You know that? They go behind the dark side of the moon and they're out of contact. You can't contact them. You've got to keep shouting out and calling. And you hope that they'll come back on the same trajectory. But sometimes you need somebody else. At that point, when they're on that dark side of the moon, who else can go in there that they can speak to and say, I hate my parents. I hate this and I hate that. But somebody who just, I don't know, has got skin in the game, that they respect, that is non-judgmental. And we don't have enough of them. Sometimes the culture around, why would you want men involved in mentoring and such like, has almost ostracised men from doing it. I don't know what it is to be a young man. I know what it is to be a feminist and a young woman, but I don't know what it's like to be a young guy. And actually we need more men. I don't think that lots of the young people and young men that I speak to now know what it is to be a man in 21st century Scotland. Don't know what it is to be a man, what skills you need. And perhaps we can pick up on that later. And then keeping kids out of the justice system, I've talked about that. And then just other things as around drugs and online. I was in the Drug Death Task Force. I do a lot on drugs. And whilst lots of young people aren't taking them, the smell of cannabis is ever present. And, the THC, which is, and I'll get this wrong, tetrahydrocannabinoid, which is the active ingredient, used to be around 8 to 10%. I've been working abroad. I did a bit of work in Canada around law enforcement and public health. They've got cannabis out there that's 60 and 80% THC content. Now, whereas before, like constant smoking of weed, you'd maybe end up in psychosis, after heavy usage 18 months in advance. I had a psychiatrist from Maudsley, I think, talking the other day, and he was saying if you're smoking 60 and 80% THC content, you could be in psychosis within 24 hours. So, and that's really concerning when we're talking about, that cannabis is pretty eponymous out there, We just seem to think, it's just weed. And yet the only people that I hear speaking about it say to me, it was great. See, when I took it, I just felt calm. I felt relaxed. My brain wasn't going 100 miles an hour. But that's trauma, isn't it? And all that things. And my colleague James Docherty said that when he first tried it, and James is, he's in the fellowship, etc. He said, when I first tried it, Karyn, and he came from trauma and all this thing, he said, I thought everybody should take it. I thought the judges should take it. The police should have a go of it. He said, because it just made me feel calm. And that's always stuck with me, just around that desire for just feeling like everybody else. And then I suppose I'll just finish off about the manosphere. So I've been doing lots of work around incel culture because I'm in school and because I'm really interested in it. So I don't know how much people know about the manosphere. So their whole ethos is that men are superior and dominant. Women are expected to be meek and submissive. Good luck, guys. And they advocate for, and it is, this is a really contentious subject, the removal of women's rights, the legalisation of rape, the reduction of women to sexual slaves, removing the age of consent, and it encourages sort of violent enforcement and patriarchal domination. It is slightly terrifying. Now, you will all have heard of Andrew Tate, but there are others out there that are online and, Andrew Tate's got 11 million followers. That's just the people that follow him. There are loads of lurkers on there and lots of, other platforms like 4chan and all those that are, even on Reddit, that you hear some of these things talked about. And it's called, often we get these incel cultures, and I don't have time to go into all the pilling. So they call it red pilling. If you wake up and realise that women, that you're, we've taken feminism too far, and actually, we've started to become dominant. So that's a red pill, and you've woken up and you've seen what the world looks like. Or you can take a blue pill and you're just quite happy. Or you can take a black pill. So black pilling is is about biological determinism. It's defeatism and fatalism. So lots of the murders that you see online where people have been, they've done a manifesto online, that's what's called black pilling. But when we look at the people who are there, and you're going to recognise some of this as well, they're often young men, and they predominantly are young men who are lonely. They've got anxieties around changes in sexual and gender norms about, that, what is it to be a man? They're vulnerable, they're seeking solidarity, they're lonely. They're looking for an explanation of their problems. They feel entitled and feel rejected. I mean, these are dangerous things. They feel an inability in themselves to meet, societal expectations. They're really unhappy with their lives, and they're depressed. 60% of them have been diagnosed with depression. And, they've got suicidal ideation. So you see a lot of the people who black pill that often take their own lives afterwards, but they take out other people. So you'll have seen some of the stuff in the States, but we've also seen it in the UK, where there's sort of murder and then suicide, and often self-harming. So we need to think about that, how life is changing. I'll often go into schools and teachers will say that they've got a hand signal that they use to show that they're in part of this culture, which is, I'm not going to do it here because I'm not a guy. I just don't have that equipment. But they use a hand signal to show that that's what they're doing. And sometimes teachers will say to me they're seeing that sort of behaviour, and it's really difficult. Things are changing so fast, and we need to keep up. So, but can I tell you, when I look at what Scotland was like and what it's like now, it's dead easy to be really depressed, but I actually think that things are changing for the better, but we need to keep on it. It's easy for it to go backwards as well. We need to have a sense of aspiration and and we need to imbue that with our young people as well, and to have patience with them. I mean, it's dead easy to be impatient with them. Don't read the Daily Mail, people. Just don't do it, I mean, it makes you think that everything's going to hell in a handcart, and it's not. Crime has come down, and I know people don't like to believe that. It has come down. Things are better. It's changing. There's a lot of online crime. I'm looking at the police officer in the room now and thinking, well, what are we doing about online crime? But it has changed, and it is better. And actually, I think if we have a bit of an aspiration for Scotland, we could move it even further on. But it is difficult in 5-month political cycles. We need to get people to commit to the long term. And I know that if we've got under 18s out of prison, I know that will flatten the prison. I hate using flatten the curve because that came from COVID, didn't it? But it will. If you don't have them in now, if they're not infected with the justice system, hopefully they'll meet somebody, not get into the system later on. So we'll get fewer people in the prisons. And then maybe we can close down a few prisons. Because it costs about 350 million to build a new prison for about 900 people, and then 80,000 a year to keep that prison going for each person. So it's an expensive way to manifest failure, isn't it? To deal with failure. But I'm dead full of hope. I mean, I still like going out and speaking to our young people. And actually, for all the problems there's so many solutions, but we just need to go with the evidence. Is that enough to start off with?
Yeah, no, that was great and a great introduction. I've just got a couple of questions for you, and then we'll get more people involved. But we had a very good online session about research that a professor in York had done around the manosphere, and showing just how many young men knew about it, but then how many got pulled into it. And she'd also done some work in schools where teachers were saying, we need help with this. We don't know how to manage this or approach it. And I suspect there's people in this room that are thinking, well, if I know there's a young man who's been part of this or is interested in this, what can we do?
So, well, that's a great question. There aren't enough services, and teachers don't feel confident enough talking about it. So sometimes, and I was speaking to a group of older people, I have to say, and I was talking about black pilling and blue pilling and Stacey's and Chad. This is all the terminology they use, and I could see people's eyes widening. You know, I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, but I don't like it. I mean, it was sort of, what was the television programme that was on? Adolescence. Now, Adolescence was actually, I don't like the second episode, but the first and the third were fantastic. You know, around trying to tell you the things that was happening. So there was a great report written, loads of research based in Scotland, but also with ideas about how we start to tackle this. Lots of that's through peers, you know, the bystander approach, which actually we started it. It was started off by this guy called Jackson Katz of the State, which is a great name. And it was about how do you get peers to challenge that behaviour? You know that? Don't talk about women like that. Don't do this. You know, and I think that that's probably the best way to try and challenge it, because me saying to them, don't talk like that. I think we need to give lots of the young people in school who don't like that sort of thing, they don't believe in the manosphere, they think it's abhorrent and wrong because they look at their mums and their sisters and think, I don't want to be part of that. We need to be able to give them the skills to challenge their peers and try and bring them back in. But for kids that are isolated and they're not in school, so kids turning up to school really worries me. You know that when they're in their bedrooms and they're online because somebody else is speaking to them, and I don't quite know how to fix that yet. But that is a challenge for kids that are isolated and depressed, and they're looking for connection. And the connection they're getting is for people who are pretty much running a Ponzi scheme. I mean, Tate runs a Ponzi scheme. He's trying to get people to spend money to go in his courses, and that's how he's making money. But of course, people see these big cars and this hyper-masculine, you know, persona. And of course, he's a really good communicator. He's a really good communicator, you know. And somebody said to me, you can't other these people. So I can't say he's a terrible person. I need to understand why as young people are listening to him. And I need to get somebody else to emulate that gives you an alternative, you know, an alternative sort of narrative. Because he is a good communicator. No wonder people listen to him.
The other thing was you talked about exclusion, and some of the work Moira and I have been doing was showing that, well, with some other organisations, it wasn't so much about school exclusion, but a lot of young people just not going to school, particularly in that transition from primary to secondary school, a much larger number than I had realised. So how is there more we can do about that?
So there have been some cases recently, and when we've looked at the backgrounds of the young people, we've picked that up. So colleagues in Glasgow, and I've been working with a sort of fabulous organisation called Peak, in Glasgow, who do all this work with young people, and you probably do as well. And they've been saying that, so the kids. So sometimes it's about if they don't get a school, So say it's at like a local school. If they don't get into that school and go to another school, they just don't go. So it's not even that they're excluded; they just don't turn up. And nobody chases them because, of course, we don't have we used to have the school inclusion officers used to go out and do all that work. And actually some of them weren't great, but loads of them are fantastic. Like try to encourage the parents, but then you may have parents that are, depressed and all these challenges, but their kids have to go to school because the outcome is really terrible. So there is work going on, but I think we need to recognise that that's happening because we pick up the exclusion figures, but we don't pick up that one about that jump. And we need to get education authorities to start to talk about it. But that thing around, I used to talk about this in policing, the performance indicators that we have drive a certain type of behaviour. If you're judged on your attainment, you might not want these kids in school. So you've got to really try hard to get them in your school. So I know some head teachers who absolutely will and who just think, let's shame the devil. Let's just, bring the kids in. Absolutely, that's our job. But we need to change the outcomes for schooling. I absolutely realise that, being able to read and write and engage is really important, but well-being is important as well. That having that life to be, to be engaged and to communicate and to look at kids in the round. So, I don't think my daughter should ever have went to university. She should have went into an apprenticeship. But we've got this idea about what success looks like. And actually success is just being a good human being. It's maybe, doing all the jobs that we see people going out every day, because they're the ones that are going to be important, because AI is going to be doing some of my work. It's going to be doing all that analysis work and problem solving. But what we need is people with a human factor, that can't do the things that computers don't.
Yeah, we need more emotional intelligence, even as we get more artificial intelligence.
And we should be honest about the fact that some kids just aren't going to school, and just aren't turning up.
Yeah. At our last family talk, which Danny spoke at, but also George Hoskin, who you'll know of the Wave Trust, and he was emphasising the need for more resources in early years and also the Scandinavian models of education. And there was a number of questions saying, but we've known all this for years and years and years, and nothing's changed. And you're giving us some hope that things are looking better in Scotland. But are there any specific examples of community interventions or good things happening that you could share?
Oh, grief, now let me have a think. So, there are. In fact, there's so many, that's why I'm sort of struggling, So a really interesting one. So Aberdeen, I've been working with Northfield Academy, and great head teachers, fabulous teachers there. And they decided, so they realised that transition point, the very thing that you're talking about, was really difficult for kids. They also realised that actually going to the toilets, this is going to sound bizarre, was anxiety making for lots of the young people. So what they did was a really clever thing. They brought the primary teachers in. So half and half, they brought all these primary teachers that the kids knew, and they put them in first year. They created a part of the school that was only for the first years. So they had these primary school teachers that were there all the time, that the kids knew, and they also created separate toilets for them, so that they felt safe and involved, and they had relationships with the primary school teachers who they knew, and then had the teachers. Honestly, just really simple. And that wasn't about money. That was just about, what do we do for these kids? What's the problems? And then how do we solve it? So not about money, and just about head teachers and teachers thinking, I know, we could change this. So the challenge isn't about knowing the evidence, it's about the implementation. That back to the doing what? What say we do? I have never thought, and I know that I will get pelters for this. Please don't phone me about this. People used to say to me, but we need more money. I'm like, but see, when we had loads of money, we didn't solve this either. It's about knowing what to do, about taking the evidence, putting it in place, getting our politicians to sign up for it. That's long term. And actually, those are the things that we're talking about. I think most political parties would sign up for, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Do you want your kids to have a great outcome? Yup. This is how to do it. This is the evidence base. Now, we may have a kick around some of the things that you want to put in place, but that's the way of doing it. Or like some of the work we did with a community in motion. In Glasgow, we did a community in motion. We got all the parents. It was, even now, I wonder about how we managed to do it. So we invited all the parents for a pizza night. We ordered about 120 pizzas from Domino's, which was probably the biggest order that they've ever had. And we got Pete to look after all the kids. And what we talked about is that we were all in it together. We had the campus cops came along, but the campus cops came out of uniform to show that they were just the same as everybody else. And we talked about, we had a laugh. We laughed together. And I still get parents coming up to me that day and saying, do you remember that nights that we had? So we did loads of series at nights. And we actually formed a community. And we asked the parents, because the schools were a venue. And it was really interesting. We had a whole series of unintended consequences. And we had to pick these up as well. So we had more parents coming in and reporting domestic violence to the teachers. Say, I just want you to know this is what happened in the school, in the home that night, and this is why Karyn might not be doing. And so we had to teach the teachers. We had to give them some of the skills about how they dealt with reports of domestic abuse, sexual violence in the home, about a parent in prison. Can I tell you, I know that sounds really soft. I'm so proud of the teachers that did that work, because, the ones that say, we're just meant to teach. I'm not meant to do that. No, you're not. We're meant to educate. And to be able to do that, we need to change the way that we're doing things. And I think that has loads of connection and, a human elements in it that I think was absolutely lovely. As I said, and violence went down in the school. They had lots of work around, George would put, and others we have talked about, around understanding trauma, but then what do we do about it? That it's fine being saying you're trauma aware. Yeah, that's great. But what do you do when you see kids acting out? So, for example, kids that came from domestically violent households, they didn't put beside the door of the classroom, because every time that the door rattled, the kids were jumping. So they put them over the other side of the class, far away, so they felt safer. Small things make a difference. It's 1,000 small sanities. There is no one miracle cure. There's 1,000 small sanities that you need to put in place for this to work.
Yeah. Can I just see if anybody's got a question or comment that you want to make? Hi, Dave.
Just to do it in the mic, just give me a broader recording. Almost sounds like a song. If anyone just wonder a question in the recording, please just let me know, no problem. Get it out.
Karen, really enjoyable, the talk. So we're in a football stadium. Yeah. So I guess, So I guess the question is, ultras for fans, and actually what, I guess I can see obvious benefits, but obviously challenges as well. But what's your thoughts on that?
So I sit on the board of professional football. I hadn't seen a football match before I went on the board, but I love crowds. And I take pictures. So this is a bit about connection. When I go to a football match, and I have been to lots of football matches now, and in here, I take pictures of the crowd. And you know what I love about it? Nobody's got their phone out. They're just absolutely connected to the person next to them. So when they get a goal, they're cuddling the person next to them who they don't know. I don't think they ask for permission when they cuddle them, but they don't know, but they're just completely connected to each other. And I love that, because I can't think of many mass participation events that we now have. People are online all the time. That is not connection. Well, not in my book, because I actually think you need to be together. But there has been a thing that's happening in Scotland, and it's one of the things that I'm really interested in, is about the rise of the ultras, for people that, you know what ultras are, sort of, and you'll see them in stadium when you go in there, they're incredibly noisy, they bring colour and noise and enthusiasm, and they are really loud, to football matches. But there is also stuff that goes along with them. So that we've had challenges with pyrotechnics getting set off, and we're seeing problems with unacceptable conduct and chanting and a whole range of things. So I went to an Aberdeen Celtic match, and I was watching outside. Parents were actually dropping off their young people to go and join. They were actually dropping them off to go and join the ultras. There was around 650 of them in this one stand. Now, these are not opposing moral universes. On the one hand, people will they'll think they are terrible, I don't like them, they're doing this and that and the next thing, and they've got banners and whatever else. But on the other hand, so they all turned up with these bucket hats on, and just in black T-shirts and, black sweatpants. So it was the expensive wear that we're wearing. So they'd obviously communicated about what the dress code was. They were organised. They all turned up at a certain point. They were obviously team working, because they had the banners and they decided what they were going to do during the match. And it was all young people. That dying to belong to something. So again, we can't demonise them. We have to look at what's positive about it. Try and manage the other bits around the pyro, etc. And actually there wasn't much pyro let off at that time. There was only one or two, and it was one or two people, and you're always going to have that, isn't it? It's like when you go out with a group of friends, there's always a few people who are idiots and do stuff. But the majority of people act quite responsibly, but they don't want to be contained. Young people don't want to be contained, they want to be out there and, be individual and identify themselves. It's like, and all of us will have had experience of trying to go into groups, whether you were a goth or an emo or whatever it is now, or K-pop, whatever it is, you want to look like a part of something. And I think we just have to appreciate that part, manage the unacceptable behaviour, but not try and other young people so much. But it's a real thing in Scotland, and much more so than in England and Wales. And for anybody who watches European football, you will see it's, I mean, they are letting off tons of pirate. I mean, it's quite scary when you look at it. But I think we need to try and grasp what's good and understand why it is. Why are all these young people turning up to be part of something? And it's expensive. Football tickets are not cheap, generally, in comparison to other countries. So they're getting something out of it. And a bit like the Andrew Tate thing, we need to work out what that is and enhance it. But
And are they all boys, all males?
not always, but predominantly young men. Predominantly young men. And there'll be other people in here who perhaps are football fans, and you'll be able to tell me, you know, what you think about it. But there is something there.
Like belonging.
About belonging. And there's nothing, I mean, like even things like school sport, you know, stuff's online now. You know, they're gaming online, they're doing fantasy football, you know, that's no connection in the human sense, is it? You know, that we need that.
We need to think, can we make some of these connections online?
You can, absolutely.
Moira leads in terms of parents who are care experienced. Some of that connection does start and continue online.
No, you're right, and you need both. And of course, somebody had said to me when we were talking about social media and we were talking about incel culture, and they said, would you ban mobile phones? I said, that's never going to happen. You know, I mean, the addiction in mobile phones and that fear of missing out, and, you know, and of course, that's how tech companies have designed it to be addictive. That's never going to happen. But I do see, do you know what's really interesting when I go into schools now? I do see young people turning off. You know, I mean, I've had kids that have said to me, I try not to do it, you know. And so they are turning off, but you are right, for like parents who are really isolated, being online. My mum's 87. She is, I mean, I think she's got about 4 Twitter accounts and on Facebook, etc. And that for her, because lots of our peers have died and, you know, or are infirm, that for her is a life in itself. So far be it from me to negate that, but I still think you need a hug. And you need somebody to, you know, to look in their eyes and pick up all that non-verbal behaviour, learn how to behave in society.
Yeah. I'm just looking for hands going up, but just shout out. Can you say a bit more about cannabis then? I had not appreciated, maybe everyone else in the room had, about the increasing strength to that degree. And, you know, we do think of cannabis as not to be worried about so much. And I was in Malta recently, and they've got all these signs up saying cannabis in public is illegal, but they're not saying it's illegal in private. What should we do about that?
Do you know, see, for lots of the young people who come from, you know, and sometimes they have mental health issues that are not, you know, that are not diagnosed. I think people think that mental health conditions appear just when you're an adult. You know that, and you get a diagnosis of depression. I think they say about 40% of mental health conditions are apparent in under 14s. So some of the really quite chronic conditions can be apparent. So I can understand why people want to try and, that kids are searching for something. So the cannabis thing is really interesting. I went to Canada to do this, not for very long, but to do a public health and policing. So they have decriminalised drugs, all drugs, in Ontario and in BC. And it is fascinating. So that's obviously cannabis as well. And they've legalised it over there. And they've decriminalised all drugs up to 2.5 grams. 2.5 grams is quite a lot. 2.5 grams could kill 800 people of fentanyl. So they have like lots of nitises coming up, etc. And I have to say, I was actually really shocked. I mean, they were one of the assistant chief constables from Police Scotland, and I think we both had our hands over our mouths. And when I went to a drug injecting suite, and I saw the amount of young people that were there. And of course, cannabis was really prevalent. They are now trying to roll back from that decriminalisation. So they've got lots of studies that are ongoing, and we could get into that later on around what the impacts have been. And I think they've suddenly realised that actually, sometimes, you know, what's it, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Some of the THC content is going up, and it still is lower here, but obviously we have had, you know, some of the other forms of cannabis that have been much higher strains. But that is cannabis becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. And actually, I think in policing, I think where we used to have quite an emphasis on it, it probably still is the emphasis on it, but there's just so many, you smell it all the time. I mean, let's just be honest about this. You smell it all the time in cities. If I'm walking, I see young people smoking it, and if they're on their bikes, I get a waft of cannabis, and it's so identifiable. But it's still a drug. It's still a drug. And I think we should seek to understand if they were drinking, if they were drinking under 18s, we'd be a bit concerned about it. So I just think we have to be really careful how we're speaking about cannabis and about people's reliance on it. And, you can all do your own research and tell me what you think about it.
I'm just going to comment, buddy.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a psychiatrist recently. I'm a safeguarder, and it was a young mum who'd had her 2 children removed from her care, and she had a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist explained that she had significant mental health issues linked to her cannabis use. She was only 20, had been smoking cannabis on a daily basis from the age of 14. The psychiatrist explained that because the brain is still developing, the damage that was done was irreversible. So there might not have been a significant impact at the time, but because it was over that period of age 14 to 19, it's like the damage had been done, and she was likely to have mental health problems the rest of her life. It affected her ability to parent, and that was quite an eye-opener to me, because you knew it's a drug and it's not good, but you don't really think about that it's actually causing brain damage. So,
yeah, absolutely. And I've got a colleague, Gail, who is really expert, and she does lots of work with young people around drugs. And I think what we've realised, it's a bit like alcohol. You can't talk to young people about alcohol and say in 20 years' time you might have liver cirrhosis. You've got to tell them what their impact is right now. Actually, you'll put on weight, you might get acne. Doesn't look good, because they're so in the moment. Young people, they think they can live forever, and that doing cannabis won't affect them. And that's all that, ill health and stuff is for old people. I mean, I get into conversations around this about ketamine. So ket, special K, it really worries me just now around, so people talk about, for those that don't know, about going at the keyhole. Ketamine's an anaesthetic drug. It is prevalent. It makes you incontinent, utterly wrecks your bladder. I know 16, 17 and 18-year-olds whose bladders are utterly wrecked and will have urinary incontinence probably for the rest of their life, unless we can find some treatment to reverse that. And yet when I'm speaking about it, there's an online thing. I've even got somebody I know who's in my family who says, we take it. And I'm like, why would you do that? Because you are completely oblivious to what's happening around you. Somebody could do anything to you, anything, and you would have no recollection of it. So it's really interesting around how much they actually know about it. But there is that bit, isn't it? I mean, that's why people risk take. That's why she risk take. That's risk-taking behaviour, isn't it? Smoking cannabis, she's probably got a whole history behind her. That bit that it just made her feel better. It relaxed her. She might be able to get to sleep. And I know lots of people who've been in care, and they often talk to me about their cannabis use, and it helps them get to sleep, calm what's happened to them in their past traumas, PTSD. But that doesn't make up for the lack of mental health services that we should have out there. And, people always say, I always talk about health services. I think we all need to be trained in things like, some of the mental health approaches. We all need to do it. So I talk about motivation to change models. I used to teach the cops, Prosecco and De Clemente, motivation to change, how they have conversations with people. Because you can't go up to a young person and say, you shouldn't be doing about this. It's about, what do you think about this situation? How did it come about? What did you do that contribute to it? What would you do the next time? So you get them to come up with their own plan. You try and develop that sense of agency and change. And actually cops are saying, but I'm not a social worker. And I'm saying, but you bump into young people all the time. And that every contact leaves a trace. We used to always say that in policing, didn't we? Actually trying to get them to do the right thing at the right time. And then have another of these services. So I think we might need to think about how we train teachers and police officers and other professionals in the future. So we're not just saying, that mental health service, that waiting list 18 months. I think we're all going to need some services. And then the specific ones, the things like the EMDR and, all the really complex ones, we can perhaps leave to the mental health services. But I think there's things that we can all do. But, I feel sorry for your women. It's a hard thing to suddenly realise that you've burdened yourself with, lifelong challenges.
I remember found my teenage son smoking and said, you could get lung cancer by the time you're 50. He said, I don't want to live to be 50.
That's so old, I know.
Just task that came to my mind on the theme of drugs, and you mentioned when you were talking about being involved around the drugs deaths kind of task force and things. I wonder what your thoughts were on the drugs death stats that were just published this week, showing a slight decrease in the overall state of that landscape at the minute in Scotland.
That's a whole podcast in itself. I mean, I know some of the people who were involved in that drug deaths that have lost their lives. And it is, there's a tragedy to it that I don't think, we talk about it so banally now because it's, we've had it for such a long time. I was really interested, I don't know if anybody saw the BBC article, which was on the drop in drug deaths. And it had, and of course you will have heard it, Linda, it had a whole section of Jimmy Reid's speech that he did when he was a rector of Glasgow University, when he took on the rector, and he talked about alienation and hopelessness, and about the cry of people who were at the mercy of forces that they couldn't control, and who just felt that sense of alienation. And I thought it was a lovely piece to put in that wasn't just about the technical aspects of drugs and about access to methadone and MAT standards and all that bit, but about that bigger symptomatic bit that's around hopelessness, about not having a place in society, which is actually what we've been talking about today, about not being connected, about not having relationships, and about the role that drugs then, plays. So the thing that I get asked about most, so my mobile number, I shouldn't even say this in a podcast, is online. So, and the thing that people phone me up most about is about getting into rehab. I need to stop this, Cam. That's what they say. I'm done. I just can't do this anymore. And of course, it's really difficult to say to somebody. It's a bit like saying, that you suddenly decide you can't get, it's like me this morning. I was trying to get my trousers on. I'm wearing different trousers and I couldn't get them fastened. And I was like, right, that's it. No more chocolate. No more eating crisps. I'm going to do more exercise. I'm going to get over my knee injury and I'm going to do it now. That's really hard. If somebody's saying, I am done, and you're saying to them, right, in 12 weeks' time, you might get a place in a rehab. Or in 6 months' time, right, we may have a place for you. Like, even you do that, I can't, in 12 weeks' time, I will have eaten a lot of chocolate. I'll have eaten loads of crisps this week, I'll have done all the things that contribute to the state that I'm in. And actually, we need to make something much quicker for people so that we capitalise on that point. And people will disagree with me. I was talking about the cancer pathway the other day there. About if I go, and I have been to a GP with a lump, and it was I got an appointment that day with the GP. Honestly, absolutely, you come in right now. And then I got referred onward really quickly. I had an appointment within 2 weeks. I was seen by a consultant really quickly. That doesn't happen in drugs. It doesn't happen in drugs. We don't take it seriously, We don't say to people, you're really important. You're really important. And we've got all these things, and I know we've got a lot of people who are involved in addiction and who've got problems with alcohol and drugs. But we need to make them feel important, that they're not othered, or that we have the services that are available. And also that people think that the first time that you go to rehab, and rehab's expensive, it is. I think Castle Craig, charge upwards of 20,000 for a rehab, to get into rehab, and others is probably about the same. People think that, if you don't manage it the first time, well, that's it. You shouldn't get another chance. If that worked, Weight Watchers would have been bust a long time ago before all the GLPs and Ozempics and Mounjaros came along. Because people take loads and loads of chances to try and change their behaviour, and sometimes that's 5, 6 and 7 goes before you get into a stability to be able to think, right, I've managed it now. And I think we, and I'm talking about the service provider, we need to change our views around what works for people, and we also need to give them choice. I think MAT standards, absolutely, giving people, and I try not to get into the harm reduction methodology or abstinence debate, because for people, and who am I, to really comment on that about what works for people at a certain point in time. But we absolutely need to change the way that we approach drugs in Scotland, and perhaps not walk by people, because we get a lot of hand-wringing and pearl clutching, don't we, when the figures come out. But that's every single day for families out there, for people who are trying to get out of it. And it is going to change, because we've now got nitazines. Crack cocaine is as prevalent as ever, and it's really difficult. I mean, I had a conversation yesterday about somebody going into rehab and said, I can't even have the conversation with them, because all they want is more crack cocaine. Because it keeps people injecting the cocaine, which I'd never really seen before. Seen it in Denmark quite a bit, is now quite prevalent. So people often injecting 10, 15, 17 times a day. Nitazines that are coming onto the market. I saw it in Canada, and they're taking like really short-acting stuff, but it works quickly. I don't know if anybody's seen the stuff in the States where you see people in the streets, they're standing up, but they're bent over. So that's things called rofentanil, alfentanil, which are really quick-acting nitazines. And so it has this quick spike, so that they're like this. But what happens is they get what's called, they refer to it as dope sick. They get dope sick really quick, so they're looking for another hit. And that's really hard. And we don't often have the services that are, to try and get people got off it. So, yeah, we've thrown a lot of money at it. And don't get me wrong, it has helped loads and loads of people. But we are far from there, aren't we? We're far from done in trying to fix the challenge.
One last question for me, but I'm happy to take another one if there's ones that you want to ask Karyn. But just, you did say crime is going down, and yet our prisons are full and ever increasing. Now, I know that's your day job, that's community justice, but just give us a flavour of why is that the case?
It's dead easy. Sentencing's gone up. Whereas you used to get sentenced to 9 or 10 years, you might be sentenced to 15, 16, 17 years. There is also, and I'm just going to tell you this, and it's a really difficult one, we had lots of historic sexual abuse, and that was a good thing. We got people to report, and lots of people, and lots of older, we've got loads of older prisoners who are now in prison. But we've become really intolerant. So I'm really in favour of community justice. So I try and say, if it is safe to do so, we need to keep people in communities. And also understand that people are going to come out of prison, so we really need to invest in rehabilitation. They're going to come out. We don't jail forever, rarely. We have some people who've got, who are in for life terms, and but they're quite a small group. People are going to come out. And actually, sometimes by the time they come out, when they've done 15, 16, 17 years, trying to get them reintegrated into society is really difficult. So we need to think differently about that. But the weaponisation that we get of justice is really difficult. And we're about to come up to an election. I'm politically restricted. So this is not about any political party. But we'll start to bang the drum about longer prison sentences. So, how long do you want to jail people for? More police officers. And I refer back to the fact that when we were asked about whether we wanted 1,000 extra police officers, we said we'd rather have 1,000 extra health visitors, because that would change and prevent crime. And we never got invited to any Federation dinners ever again. And the Chief Constable pulled us both in about, sorry, what are you doing? So my colleague John Carnican, he took the hit for that. But that's a really difficult, and I talk about the evidence. So I don't talk about hard or soft justice, I talk about smart justice. What is the evidence about what works? But people sometimes don't want to hear it. But I'm still going to keep on banging the drum. And to get some sensible policies, there's an organisation down south called Common Ground. And Common Ground talks about what are the common themes that come through all the political parties that we can agree upon. And maybe that's where we need to be. But it's really difficult when the Daily Mail comes knocking, isn't it? And people think that's what gets votes. But actually, see if we can speak to each other in venues like this. I can hopefully convince you about what some of the evidence is. And we can agree to disagree. I don't know why I'm looking at you. But we can agree to disagree about things. But I can tell you what the evidence is. And think, we can have a more balanced conversation, as opposed to the conversation that you have on Twitter or Facebook, or you know that when you get all the keyboard warriors. And I mean, it's a bit like barking into cyberspace. And that's why I invest a lot of time coming to speak to people, because I quite like the discussion about what you're seeing, what I see, what we can agree upon, and what we can disagree upon and disagree well about it.
Hi, we've had a recent spate of some violent crimes in Glasgow, and one of the real complexities is that for our project, as you're working with the victim and the perpetrator families, and it's easy for me to say, but there's so much anger towards the perpetrator. And I wondered if you have any hope for more compassion towards young victims. And again, I'm not the one who's experienced the loss of my family, but do you see any movement towards that? Because I feel like that could be a real game changer.
Do you know, I don't know whether you've looked at the interview that Corey McCrimmon's father did. Can I tell you, that man, I was just, I mean, actually, even now, I think, I heard him speaking and he was talking about, and I'm probably misrepresenting him here, so if I get this wrong, please forgive me. I think he was talking about he'd grown up in care. He'd experienced lots of the things. And he talked with such compassion about the perpetrator and the circumstances that he'd grown up. And I was actually flabbergasted by just, I mean, how measured, and you know, and I don't know this man, I don't know his background, I don't know what he's done and his job, but I thought, oh my God, that is just extraordinary, where you would have expected hate and opprobrium and I want him jailed forever. He talked about compassion and hope and rehabilitation. And actually, I wanted to search him out and give him a hug, not to give him my cold, but to give him, you know. So I do a lot on restorative justice. So and when I talk about restorative justice, and that's, it's not immediate, it's often much further down the line. When I talk about restorative justice, it's not about forgiveness, it's about understanding. And I've done lots of restorative justice, and often victims' families where murder's been, and it's about sitting in front of the person who has often caused the harm and saying, this is what you did to me. This is how you made me feel. And sometimes the outcome, I just want to say this, is forgiveness. But you know something, it's about power. It's about victims taking the power back, not feeling, because the power's taken away from you when you're the victim of violent crime. You are. And anger, it's a bit like grief, anger and denial, you know, that process is there. But I really like some of the restorative justice processes, but it is not rolled out across Scotland. Access to it is really narrow. And sometimes you can have restorative circles. So for some of the victims' families is to have those, is to be able to allow them to process some of the feelings that they have. And also allowing them, and I'm going to say this poorly as well, the criminal justice process is quite you're almost excluded as a victim in a victim's family. So we talk about victim impact statements, etc. That's not a big thing at the moment in Scotland. It probably will be later on. But for them to say how it made them feel, what the impact was of it. And I think for young people and for their families, that's really important, because who wants to see their kid harmed? I mean, of course you're going to be angry. You're going to feel that you feel powerless, you want to do something. We need to get much better at trying to address some of those feelings and come up with, you know, some of the and restorative justice. Some of those, being able to listen to families and be able to give them a part in the system. And also you say to people, is it how you would want? You know, sometimes many moons ago, I did a bit of public attitude survey. I thought, I'm never asking the Scots ever again. So we asked about 9,000 Scottish people. Do you want longer prison sentences? And about 80% of them said, yes, longer prison sentences. You know, some of them slightly wanted it. It was a Likert scale, you know, some of them really wanted it. And then 3 questions down the line, we said, do you think prison works? And 70% of them said, no, we don't think prison works. And I'm like, oh my God, let me try and think about this. So you want longer prison sentences, but you don't think it works. And then we said to them a really interesting thing. We said, do you think we should have capital punishment? And it was quite shocking for me. Around 67% of them said yes. So some of them said they slightly wanted it, and some of them said they really wanted it. And I was like, I think you'll find this is quite binary. You know, this execution thing, you know, we either take your life or we don't. But I thought that was really interesting around, we got rid of capital punishment in this country because we just thought it was the right thing to do. We thought it was wrong. And it wasn't because the public wanted it, because obviously there's quite a big part of the public that's like, yes, absolutely. But there is a bit around how we talk about those who've caused harm, how we allow also the person who's caused harm to repair and to rehabilitate and to re-enter society. And I don't think we've quite got that right. I still think, you know, that Calvinism bit that I talked about, and I would, you know that if it's nice today, it'll rain tomorrow, and our favourite sweet is a fisherman's phrase, extra strong. I mean, I laugh about it, but it is very much in us. You know that, I know who your family are. I know where you come from. He's all he will ever be. And I often talk about why I started the Violence Reduction Unit, and it was because of a murder of a young person. And I thought there would be a Rosa Parks moment, you know, that people coming out and saying, we're done, we have had enough of this. And I went out to the local area and I spoke to a woman, it was an older woman, and I said, what do you think of that? And she said, he was all he was ever going to be. At 16, he was all he was ever going to be. You know, that judgment that we make about young people and their outcomes and where they come from and their families, that's bad. I mean, and I recognise that, and I don't know whether you recognise that as well. That's part of Scotland I don't like. So, and I'm sure that plays into what you're doing, but I mean, I think you do great work. Can you keep doing more of it? And don't leave a glass around, because I'll be trying to human clone you at the end, you know, because we need more people doing the things that you're doing, but also getting into that early prevention so that you don't get tit for tat violence later on.
Thank you. I'll bring this to a close now, just because I know some of you need to get back to work and back to other parts of your life. But just to remind you that we've got an ongoing series of these family talks by Care Visions. And as you can tell today, we get some fantastic speakers along. So take away the flyer, tell people about it. Obviously, they can watch them all online, but it's nice to have more people in the audience. And just to finish by thanking Karyn, that was great. You've covered a lot of ground, and we just want to say thank you so much for your wisdom.
Thank you. Can I just finish off by saying, because people will be listening to this only, get involved. You know, and see when there's one finger pointing at the services, and you're saying, what are you doing about this? Remember, there's also 3 fingers pointing back at you. What are you doing about this? These are your families, your communities. You need to get involved and be part of it, because that's the only way it will change. So be fabulous.